I had always considered myself a peaceful man, someone who valued the silence of the woods more than the noise of city life. My home sat right on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, governed by one of those dreaded homeowners associations that everyone warns you about, but you never truly understand until they come knocking on your door. For the most part, they had left me alone. I paid my dues, I kept my lawn tidy, and I stayed out of neighborhood politics. I like to hunt on weekends, not in an aggressive or flashy way, just quietly, with a small license and a deep respect for nature. The land behind our community stretched out like an untouched sanctuary, full of trails, trees, and wild game. It felt like freedom. I had used one particular trail for years with no issue. It was unmarked and overgrown, and to be honest, I assumed no one cared about it. Then, one cold Saturday morning, I came back from a long walk through the woods, only to find a bright-colored notice on the windshield of my truck. At first, I thought it was a parking warning, maybe something about blocking the curb, but as I unfolded the paper, I felt the heat rise in my chest. It was a fine issued by the HOA for $2,000. The reasons listed were hunting in a restricted area, unauthorized parking, and trespassing on protected HOA land. My hands shook as I read it. None of it made sense. This was the same trail I had always used, and there had never been a sign or notice or even a fence suggesting it was off limits. I tried calling the HOA office that Monday morning, and of course no one picked up. I left a detailed message and sent a long email asking for clarification. Their response, 2 days later, was short, cold, and dismissive. They claimed the trail belonged to the HOA and was designated as common green space, and that hunting of any kind was strictly prohibited. They said the area I accessed was not an approved entrance, and therefore I had also violated safety rules. No hearing, no conversation, just a demand for payment. I felt humiliated and angry. I had always followed the law. My license was valid, I had left no damage or mess, and yet here I was being punished for enjoying the very woods that had kept me sane. At first, I considered paying the fine and letting it go. That is what most people would do. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized how wrong it was. I started asking around, talking to neighbors, digging through old maps and property lines. What I found made my jaw drop. The trail I had been using did not actually sit on HOA property. It ran along the edge of a parcel owned by a private landowner who lived out of state. The HOA had no claim to it, but they had still fined me. Worse still, they had installed a small wooden sign near the entrance after I got the notice, trying to make it look like it had always been there. That was the last straw. I tracked down the name of the landowner using the county website. It took a few emails and a couple of phone calls, but eventually I reached him. He was an older gentleman who had inherited the land from his father and had no interest in keeping it. When I asked if he would be willing to sell, he seemed almost relieved. We talked numbers, I checked my savings, I even sold an old car and dipped into a small investment fund I had been saving for a rainy day. Within 3 weeks, I signed the papers and became the legal owner of a 5-acre strip of land that just so happened to include the very trail the HOA and their precious hikers loved to use. I could have just posted no trespassing signs and been done with it, but after the way they had treated me, I wanted to make a point. I hired a local contractor to put up a proper fence around the entrance. I installed a locked gate with a camera. Then I sent an official notice to the HOA informing them that their members were no longer permitted to use or access the trail, as it now crossed private property. Their response came fast and furious. They claimed I was being unreasonable, that I was disrupting community enjoyment, that I was punishing innocent families. I replied with the same cold tone they had once used on me. I reminded them that I was the legal owner and that trespassing would be met with legal action. The fallout was immediate. Residents began complaining, the HOA tried to spin the story and blame it on me, but word got around fast. People learned the truth, that the HOA had overstepped, that they had fined someone unfairly and gotten burned. Eventually, they stopped trying to fight. They even stopped replying to my emails. It was over. I had won. But the real victory was not in closing the trail. It was in proving that you cannot bully someone just because you wear a title or hold a clipboard. In the months that followed, I made that little slice of land my sanctuary. I built a small bench under an old tree where I would sit and listen to the wind. I put up trail cameras to monitor the wildlife. Sometimes I would invite a friend or two to walk the path with me, just to remind myself that this land now served peace and not politics. I never hunted there again, not because I was scared, but because I no longer needed to. I had found something greater than sport. I had found justice. One afternoon, as I was sitting on the bench, I saw a family standing outside the fence. A father with 2 kids looking at the locked gate. He seemed confused and a little disappointed. I walked over and explained the story. I told him why the gate was there. He nodded and said he had no idea, that the HOA never told him the full truth. I told him I was sorry the kids could not hike there anymore. He said no need to apologize, that he respected me for standing up for myself. That moment meant more to me than any deer I had ever tracked. It meant someone understood. This entire ordeal taught me more about people than I ever wanted to know. It taught me that power unchecked becomes arrogance, that authority without accountability becomes abuse. But it also taught me that the law is a tool, not just for the powerful, but for anyone willing to learn it and use it. I was not rich, I was not a lawyer, but I had time, patience, and the will to fight. And sometimes that is all you need. I never got my money back from the HOA. They never apologized, but I didn't need them to. My land spoke louder than their letters. My fence stood taller than their threats. Every time I walked that trail, I was reminded of what I had built. Not just a path through the woods, but a path through injustice back to dignity. To anyone watching this who feels bullied by their HOA or by anyone in power, I say this: do not give in, do not fold. Dig deeper, look closer. Sometimes the answer is not to fight on their field, but to build your own. That is what I did, and I would do it again. Now, when I sit under that old tree and look at the sunlight filtering through the leaves, I feel something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not just with the land, but with myself. Because I know I didn't back down. I stood tall. And in the end, that made all the difference.
Over time, the land became more than just a symbol of revenge. It became a quiet teacher, a place that reminded me of everything I had overcome and everything I had yet to learn. I began spending more time out there, not to guard it or defend it, but to listen to it. The sound of the wind moving through the trees was like a soft voice, whispering things I had forgotten to hear. The birds carried on without concern. The grass swayed with no sense of past battles. And I started to realize that maybe I had been given more than justice. Maybe I had been given a second chance at something bigger than pride. I started planting wildflowers near the edge of the trail, the part that once welcomed dozens of HOA members each weekend. Now, it stood quiet, untouched by footsteps, but alive with color. I watched the butterflies dance across the blooms and felt something soften in me. I thought about how easily this land could have stayed forgotten, how easily I could have walked away and let them win. But I did not. I chose the harder road, the longer road, and that made this peace even sweeter. People began to notice not just the closure of the trail, but the transformation of the land itself. The overgrowth turned into a meadow, the broken tree limbs cleared, the soil leveled. I did it not because I had to, but because I wanted the land to reflect the dignity I had fought so hard to reclaim. A few neighbors started reaching out quietly, off the record. They asked if they could come walk the edge with me, not to trespass, but to understand. I agreed, because understanding was what had been missing all along. They were surprised by what they saw. Not a bitter man behind a gate, but someone who had made something beautiful out of something ugly. One older neighbor brought me a pie as thanks. She said her grandson used to hike that trail every Sunday, and he cried the day they found the fence. She told him the truth, that the HOA had messed up, that the man who owned it now was not cruel, just tired of being punished for doing nothing wrong. She asked if her grandson could come see the wildflowers. I said yes, and I meant it. He came the next day, wide-eyed and quiet. He did not say much, but when he left, he waved and smiled. That was enough. I began to document the journey, not for the public, not for likes or views, but for myself. I took photos of the seasons changing, the flowers blooming, the first snowfall on the trail. I kept a small notebook where I wrote how I felt each time I walked the path. Sometimes I wrote about the injustice, other times I wrote about the stillness. Most of the time I just wrote what I heard from the woods. The rustle of leaves, the crackle of branches, the distant call of a hawk. The land was alive, and so was I. Then, one spring morning, something unexpected happened. I got a letter, not from the HOA, but from the city. They wanted to know if I would consider opening the trail to the public as part of a community nature program. They had heard from residents about the space and thought it could be a great educational site for local schools. At first, I laughed. The irony was thick. After all that had happened, now they wanted access? But I did not tear up the letter. I set it down and thought about it. I walked the trail that afternoon with the letter in my pocket. I listened to the birds and watched the squirrels dart from tree to tree. I imagined children walking the same path, learning about trees and soil and wildlife. It was not the HOA asking this time. It was the people, and that made all the difference. I replied a week later with a proposal. The trail could be opened, but only under my terms. It would be for education only, no casual hikers, no political events, no HOA banners. The city would maintain security and cleanup, and every visitor would learn the story of the land and what it meant to stand up for your rights. They agreed. And just like that, the land that was once the battleground of my quiet war became a classroom, a sanctuary, and a bridge between silence and understanding. Children came with notebooks, and teachers carried bird guides. The gate stayed locked, but the path behind it opened again, this time not for entitlement, but for learning. I watched from a distance, sometimes leaning against an old oak tree, as kids traced their fingers along the bark or gasped at a fox darting through the grass. They did not see fences or fines. They saw wonder. That was the greatest victory of all. In the end, I did not just reclaim my peace. I reshaped it. I did not just shut down injustice. I built something in its place. And every time the wind rustled through those trees, I knew the land remembered. It remembered what had been done to it. And it remembered who had stood up and said no more.